Welcome to the Center for Global Humanities at the University of New England. Established in September of 2009, the Center is a public forum for the discussion of critical issues facing our world today. We believe that the humanities can make a difference, and we encourage our audience and listeners to join us at www.une.edu/cgh. The Center is proud to offer its first Crosley Lecture this evening. The Crosley Endowed Lecture Series was established in memory and honor of Barbara Goodbody's great-grandfather and mother, Reverend Marion and Mehitable Swift Crosley. The Reverend Crosley was a Universalist minister who lived in Portland from 1885 to 1889 and served on the board of the Westbrook Seminary, which later became Westbrook College, which merged with the University of New England in 1996. The lecture, inaugurated in 1984, was initially devoted to the topic of ethics, but the founding of the Center for Global Humanities and the launch of the Global Initiatives program at the University of New England led to the renaming of the lecture to best reflect Barbara's interest in global traditions and her tireless immersion in the world of ideas and the arts. So thank you all very much for coming this evening. I could go on for probably half of the period of the hour talking about Anouar, listing some of the things that he's done for UNE. But just briefly, to say a few things. The talk tonight is the past and future of American-Muslim relations. And there's probably no one in the country better qualified to speak on this question than Anouar Majid. Professor Anouar Majid will walk us through the history of American-Muslim relations, outline what unites and divides the two cultures, reflect on the most sensitive issues in the complex relationship between the United States and the Muslim world, and suggest ways for both civilizations to build a better future. Anouar is the founding director of this Center for Global Humanities and Associate Provost for Global Initiatives at the University of New England. He's the author of several critically acclaimed books, including Unveiling Traditions, published by Duke University in 2000, and recommended by the American Association of University Professors as a book for understanding the context of 9/11. Freedom and Orthodoxy, Islam and Difference in Post-Andalusian Age, published by Stanford University in 2004. A Call for Heresy, Why Dissent is Vital to Islam in America, published by the University of Minnesota Press in 2007. We Are All Moors, Ending Centuries of Crusades Against Muslims and Other Minorities, also by Minnesota in 2009. And most recently, just this year, Islam and America, Building a Future Without Prejudice, from Rowman and Littlefield. Reviewing Islam in America, Publishers Weekly called the book an important work and added, Majid's message is critical in today's political climate, and this work is a worthwhile contribution to an ongoing dialogue. Booklist also praised the book and wrote, forthright and fair, Majid's analysis will not satisfy everyone, but that's exactly the point. As Majid states, quote, conversations humanize us, unyielding certitudes turn us into warring tribes and killing machines, unquote. Professor Majid has lectured and given keynote addresses at major universities and cultural institutions in the United States and around the world. He also contributed opinion pieces to the Chronicle of Higher Education, the Washington Post, and other media outlets. Several of his articles have been reprinted in different publications. Anouar Majid is also a novelist, the author of C. Yusuf, 1992, reprinted in 2005. In late 2003, he co-founded and started editing Tingis, the first Moroccan-American magazine of ideas and culture. The magazine is now established under the new title of Tingis Redux. Majid also hosts a related blog titled Tingitana. Majid has been described by Cornel West in his book Democracy Matters as one of the few towering Islamic intellectuals. His work and life have been profiled by Bill Moyers in the PBS program, Bill Moyers Journal, and by Al Jazeera Television. In a new film titled Islam Unknown, released by Icarus Films, He's one of 8 leading global scholars interviewed by the Dutch philosopher Fons Elders on Islam and the West. Majid represented Morocco in a summit with American evangelicals, the first of its kind, and has addressed Western and Muslim audiences about the need for heresy and critical thinking in their societies. He will be addressing prominent Arab leaders this coming Saturday at a special event in New York on the Arab Spring and constitutionalism in the Middle East. His talk is listed under controversial topics a constitution needs to address. So please join me in welcoming tonight our distinguished speaker and local professor, Anouar Majid.
I did have many plans of how to present this, but I found myself trying to deal with a lot of information. I do recommend that you try to take a look at the book. You don't have to buy it. Maybe find it in some other ways or borrow it from a library. I'm told it costs $40 at the desk. So there are other ways you can get the book at a cheaper price. But I wanted to begin today because I think this event is being viewed from different parts of the world, in the United States, some in Morocco, and some in Spain. And so I want to share with you an exchange with an American student in Morocco. Her name is Karis Husted, and she is a journalism major at Loyola University in Chicago. If you're watching, Karis, hi. So she emailed me today, and we were talking. She's in Tangier. She's trying to find people to interview about a project she's working on. She's spending a semester in Morocco. And she said, in the course, I said, well, I'm giving a talk about this and that. And she said she'll be watching. And then she said, I will definitely tune into your lecture tonight. I'm always interested in American-Muslim relations. The subject reminds me of what one Moroccan friend told me on election night. Americans didn't like Obama because they thought he was a Muslim, she said. But there are Moroccans who said the reason they liked him was just because they thought he was a Muslim. What a contrast. So now, hopefully, I'll be able to give an answer, and maybe not. But the thing is, the last election, as some of you know, and that's an email, as I published in Tingis Redux recently, Islam was everywhere behind the scenes. It sounds like an oxymoron, but we know that Barack Hussein Obama has long been accused of being a Muslim or a secret Muslim or a pseudo-Muslim, but nobody knew that Romney has also strong associations with Islam. You know, when the Mormon church was established, came on the political scene, religious scenes in the United States in the 19th century, people actually identified Mormonism as a Muslim conspiracy. They saw, so it was a very, Brigham Young, for example, because of polygamy, Salt Lake City was associated with Mecca. The Book of Mormon was compared to the Quran, and on and on and on. There's an incredible literature that testifies, that shows that people in the public opinion in the United States that showed Mormonism as part of a Muslim conspiracy that had to be defeated. And so there were two men contending for the election, one member for a church that did not exist when the Constitution was written, and the other one was not fully human when the Constitution was drafted. One of them ended up being president of the United States, and as you know, they are leading us into the next 4 years. I think that's a tribute, as I will say later, to American democracy and why America still is indispensable for global peace and prosperity. So in thinking about the lecture today, I thought I tried to make some connections to Maine. You know, what is it? What role has Maine played in the Middle East? And are there other connections besides Mormonism and Obama in our lives that connect us to the Middle East? Well, more than 2 years ago, maybe more than 3 years ago, the Jerusalem Post published an article, and I'm going to read you little pieces from it to give you a sense of how Maine, will give you an idea of the climate in the 19th century America, and what, as I say, as a way to get into our subject. It's called An American Colony in Jaffa, published in the Jerusalem Post on November 27th, 2009, by Joanna Parasasuk, Polish last name, I'm not so sure I'm pronouncing it correctly. One of the many luxury housing projects rising in southern Tel Aviv, one named The Village, takes its inspiration from a curious source. In 1866, a small band of American Christians established a tiny colony on the empty sands outside Jaffa city walls. Led by a controversial and charismatic preacher, they believed they could hasten the second coming of Jesus Christ by encouraging Jewish resettlement of Palestine. Today, all that remains of the tiny colony, located between Jaffa and the Florentin neighborhood, are 4.5 wooden buildings, which predate the modern state of Israel and the city of Tel Aviv. One of these structures was restored in 2002 by Maine residents Reed and Jean Holmes and transformed into a museum. David Bolton, grandson of Reed Holmes, explained that the Jaffa colony story begins in 1866 in Jonesport, Maine. It was the brainchild of George Jones Adams, a Shakespearean actor and Methodist preacher turned Mormon missionary. When the Mormons excommunicated Adams, he decided to found his own church and establish a colony in the Holy Land. Adams was a charismatic man, and he had no difficulties in gathering around him a group of believers willing to leave their homes and build a new life in the Palestine. Interestingly, the growing Zionist movement in Turkish Mandate Palestine responded positively to Adams' plans. Article goes on and says, Adams was a colorful and controversial figure in Maine, attracting followers from mainstream churches to join his congregation. Early one August morning, 1866, I'm skipping a little bit, he and his group of 156 followers set sail from Jonesport, Maine, aboard the three-masted clipper Nellie Chapin. Their destination was the ancient port of city of Jaffa, and when they arrived and so on, a few months later, within 6 months of their arrival, 20 people had tragically perished from disease. Despite the disease outbreak and harsh conditions, the colonists set to work building a little piece of Maine outside Jaffa city walls. Traditional Maine-style wooden buildings, which optimistically included a hotel intended to house potential tourists, were described in reports as large as and very comfortable, some of them finished in a tasty manner. However, reports began to trickle back to Maine that things were not going as well as expected. Jaffa disease was rife. Jaffa locals were apparently bemused by the colonists' ultra-modern plows and refused to hire them as farm laborers. By October 1867, an appeal for financial aid was made via U.S. Newspapers, but received only a single dollar. Eventually, Mark Twain, when he visited the region, he wrote about them, and eventually they started appealing to the governor of the state of Maine, and within a short period of time, the colony had collapsed, and some of the buildings were bought by some Germans, members of the German Templars. Only a few buildings remained, and it's one of these buildings that were purchased that were restored by Reed and Jean Holmes, and now they're part of and now there's a museum in the area that commemorates this whole episode. It's called the Maine Friendship House Museum in Tel Aviv, and it's open to visitors on Fridays and Saturdays from 12 p.m. to 3 p.m. Now, this episode here is a very interesting one because it encapsulates a lot of the large history and complex history of American Islam. I mentioned America in the beginning because America was America before there was a United States of America. And so we need to start there first in order to elucidate some of the complexities and confusions surrounding America's United States relationship with the Muslim majority nations or the Islamic world in general. America was discovered in 1492. Well, I said discovered advisedly. It was discovered for Europeans by European sailor Christopher Columbus in 1492. And when Christopher Columbus came here, and when he was making his case to the Spanish monarchs, he said, the reason why I'm doing this, which is not very well known in most of the mainstream thinking about relations between America and Islam, he said, the reason I'm doing this is because my ultimate goal is to reconquer Jerusalem. This is the pitch he made to the king and queen of Spain, and it was fairly well understood among the monarchs of Spain and the intelligentsia of the world at the time, of the European, of the Spanish Catholic establishment. So, and then, of course, following the discovery of America, Muslims were forbidden by decree after decree after decree, to establish or to immigrate to these lands. They are the historic villains of Christendom, of Christian Europe, and the Jews too were forbidden from and Lutherans, which stood for Protestantism after a while, but basically they were forbidden from establishing themselves in the New World, which Spain controlled, and Spain and the Iberian, and also Portugal at some point. But the Spanish conquistadors were good in some things and not good at others, and Spain progressively lost control over the trade, intercontinental trade, and over its dominion in different parts of the global economy, and they were progressively replaced by the hated Lutherans. Now, it is with the coming of the Lutherans that the relationship between the Islamic world, between Islam and the West, enters a new phase. Martin Luther was a notorious anti-Semite. He of course, there are a lot of writings in which he doesn't mince his word about what he thinks about Jews. But what he did, he opened up the study and the reading of the Bible to the layperson. So his Protestant Reformation, for the first time, allowed people to read the Bible for themselves, and more importantly, to discover the Old Testament. And it is the Old Testament that the Protestant religion, at the symbolic level, is mostly associated with. Think of many names in the New World, think of names of children, and you'll find that most of them come associated with the Old Testament, not with the new one. So what it did is they discovered in this Old Testament basically Abraham's promise to the Israelites or to the Hebrews to give them part of what we nowadays call the Middle East or the land of Canaan. And God's promise cannot be broken, it is binding. So anybody who tries to contest that falls out of the faith. It is so the part of the Protestant theology then, from the very beginning, involved a belief in the restoration of Jews to the Holy Land. Now, in the 17th century, in the 1600s, we begin to see appeals being made to the monarchs, to leaders, to the Ottoman Empire. Lord Palmerston, the Foreign Secretary of Britain, the Foreign Minister of Britain, made a very powerful appeal, and I have a lot of quotes here, but he made a very powerful appeal to the Turkish Empire, or the Ottoman Empire, to let the Jews resettle in the Promised Land. And those appeals were followed by many other appeals. Prominent people of the period, Isaac Newton is one of them, but Milton and others, many, many people, writers, poets, literary people, believed in this vision, that the Jews, by mandate from God, have to return to the Holy Land if we are going to fulfill the Christian or Protestant promise. Now, and then of course, the Earl of Shaftesbury, who was the most prominent and liberal reformer of the 19th century, even described it in terms that very much resemble what was stated in the Balfour Declaration of 1917. Basically, that the Jews have a right to the Promised Land. They have to be settled in a place without people without a nation settling in a place without people, which is that language more or less that was taken up again in 1917 and after the advent of Zionism in the late 19th century. So the reason I'm beginning to say this a little bit out of script, because to show you, because I guess I'm doing this a little backwards. I wasn't planning on speaking about this issue in the beginning, but what I'm trying to say is, in looking at the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, or the United States intervention and unfairness towards the Palestinians, because that's something a lot of Arabs and Muslims complain about. People, and so they attribute America's unfairness to to powerful lobbies in Washington or to international money, all kinds of conspiracies and grand schemes. But really, it isn't. You know, the first some. I mean, this began with this what we have now going on in the Middle East started with the Protestant Reformation and kept going at a steady pace all the way to our day. For example, in the 19th century, when now to come back to this thing I read you about this event in this Maine in the Holy Land, in the 19th century, people discovered the Holy Land. There was a mania for the Holy Land, particularly with the missionary movement in both sides, in the British and the American side, that was sort of energized by the American Revolution, and everybody wanted to go to the Holy Land. Holy Land. People studied the Bible in Sunday schools, and very often, both in England and also here, people were more familiar with the geography of the Holy Land than their local geographies. That's why in Sunday schools they knew where the places were, but if you asked them about the geography of their nations, they couldn't really tell you exactly where things were. So it had a very powerful impact on the British American imagination. And it is in this context that the seeds of a movement that we nowadays, with the problems we have in the Middle East, really started. And for example, the Americans and British and European writers who said the same thing. Before Theodore Herzl wrote his famous treatise on the Jewish state in 1896, if I have my dates correctly now. And so there are people just 2 years prior to that who wrote exactly the same thing. That is known as Christian Zionism. They wanted to resettle the Jews, or restorationism it is called in the literature, in order to fulfill the Christian millennialist prophecy, whereby Jesus will come either after 1,000 years of peace or to inaugurate 1,000 years of peace. And that's a very interesting part of the story. But let me go back again to the discovery of America. When the pilgrims set out to come to this, European pilgrims, they came here on the Mayflower. The Mayflower had already traded in the Mediterranean and very familiar with Islamic lands. Not to forget, I'm just mentioning it in passing, that up to the middle of the 18th century, Britain had more troops facing the Mediterranean than they had in the New World, in Gibraltar and Minorca. That's where the trade was, as the American Revolution would show for Americans as well. And we have this conception that in our mind, being in America, that America was a very new world to the British. Native Americans were not comparable to the mighty Ottomans and members of the Islamic civilization. So they were much more careful and prudent. Muslims were capturing a lot of European sailors, which the British had to ransom. And so there was an ongoing war or skirmishes going on between those two sides across the Mediterranean, that more British troops were stationed, as I said, up to almost in the middle of the 18th century than they were in the New World. So when the pilgrims came here, they inherited this notion of Islam as a villain, as a fraudulent religion, the prophet as an imposter, and think of all the negative terms that have been associated with the prophet from evangelicals, people who want to burn the Quran in Florida, and I'm sure you're aware of all these incidents. And people get all outraged about this, and rightly so. They say, they can't believe that such things happen in this day and age, that such ignorance exists in the midst of a great civilization like the United States. But anybody who looks back from the day the pilgrims landed to today would see a very consistent pattern of identifying and relating to Islam, particularly among those evangelicals, and most especially with members who tend to be of the Protestant faith. So that image was well established, and also not to forget, between the time the pilgrims came here in 1620 or thereabouts, to the time of the American Revolution, the Ottoman Empire loomed huge was a major power in the Mediterranean, and so there was a tremendous amount of nervousness, as I've said in the case of Britain, about this mighty civilization. Now we know, in retrospect, that the Ottoman Empire was on its way, sort of, has already entered a moment of decline. But at that time, there was absolutely no doubt in the British imagination that the Ottoman was a major, major empire to be dealt with in a very serious fashion. So when they did trade, the vessels, when they traded in the Mediterranean, they were captured, and eventually American sailors would be caught, colonial American sailors would be caught in this web of that the corsairs, not the pirates or privateers, if you will, set up for them, and they raise money in churches to ransom them, and then in the process of doing so, the colonial Americans would denounce Islam as a false religion, as a heresy, as a fraudulent, the prophet as a debauched individual, and all the very bad negative stereotypes some of them are not suitable for a family gathering like this, but all of the bad things you could think of are mentioned and were cited by these evangelical preachers. And I mean, there are numerous examples, many of them are in this book, but you could find them in other places too. So it is with this attitude towards Islam that the American Revolution exploded in the national scene. So by that time, religious fervor had been tempered by the vision of the Enlightenment. And so, what we have is now, instead of Islam being a false religion, now Islam becomes a religion that fosters tyranny, despotism, because now the revolutionaries were fighting against tyranny and despotism. And they saw Islam as the embodiment, just like they saw the Catholic Church, by the way. Both colonial Americans and revolutionary Americans saw them in the same terms. So they wanted to do something about it. They started exchanging accusations. So Jefferson would be called something like a Muhammad kind of person, and they were changing. I mean, that's the literature again. If you look back at some of the accusations and the politics, the dirty politics of the period, you'd find a lot of these mutual exchanges, and each side accusing the other of being a Muslim, because Islam again was the embodiment, as particularly when they looked at Turkey with the Janissaries as the embodiment of tyranny and despotism, and it is something that the America is decidedly not. America was taking a radically different path, and Islam embodied just the very opposite. So, when then American Revolution was completed, so to speak, the United States found itself in a very interesting situation. The trade was in the Mediterranean. Everybody went to the Mediterranean to do business. Britain had long accommodated itself to what at that time were called the Barbary states. Tripoli, Tunis, Algiers. All three of them were regencies of the Ottoman Empire. They had a very nominal attachment to the Ottoman Empire, and Morocco, which was an independent sultanate or kingdom, and that was doing its own thing. So those four countries controlled access to the Mediterranean. So every time the vessels sailed across, sailed from the Atlantic into the Mediterranean, many of them would be attacked and the ships captured, and the crew. And so the British were already paying ransom, or tribute, I should say, to these regencies for safe passage. The Americans were taken by surprise by this. They had just fought a revolution. They believe in freedom and freedom of access. Why would they be dealing with this, desperados, with this kind of terrorist? And the word terrorist, by the way, was used to describe them after 9/11. Why would they be paying money to this terrorist for doing business in the Mediterranean? A big discussion ensued. So there were people were for paying tribute and others who were not. Jefferson initially was a hawk against doing so. Eventually, he moderated his views. But what happened was, in the beginning, they saw no recourse, no alternative to paying tribute, or at least to paying ransom to get back American prisoners in the prison houses of these very primitive places, by the way, in these regencies. And in the process of dealing with this, the United States decided to build a Navy. And then the Navy is a direct result. The establishment of an American Navy was a direct result to the confrontations with the Muslim powers in North Africa. And so, and what's interesting, and Obama, by the way, in one of his talks in the Middle East, I think it's probably either Turkey or Cairo, mentioned when in 1797, when the United States was negotiating with Tripoli, interesting case. We are back in Tripoli. So when we're negotiating in Tripoli, the U.S. government said we are in no sense a Christian nation. We have nothing but esteem and respect for the Muslims. And the United States, it's a very interesting phase, intensely debated by the two sides in American politics. The American government states very clearly that we are not a Christian nation. And so it's a very interesting thing in the debate of the firewall, the separation of state and church that has consumed America for a long time. So then in 1804, when the problem persisted, Jefferson recruited a native of Portland. His name is Edward Preble. He's a very temperamental man. He was given charge of the USS Constitution, a newly built ship, to take command of a newly built ship and go and take care of this, Barbary corsairs and sort of subdue Tripoli and make Tripoli. American ships had already been captured by the Tripolitans prior to this event. So he led a group of people, many of them are American heroes, like Stephen Decatur. And then they went and they accomplished a great feat. They beat the Tripolitans in 1804, and the following year, Francis Scott Key wrote a poem to commemorate Stephen Decatur and this act of heroism. Let me just give you. I wrote it. I'm trying to remember where I put it. Yeah, and part of the poem says, and of course, he wrote the national, the spangled. In the conflict resistless, each toil they endured, till their foes fled dismayed from the war's desolation. And pale beamed the crescent, its splendor obscured by the light of the star-spangled flag of our nation, where each radiant star gleamed a meteor of war, and the turbaned heads bowed to its terrible glare. Now mixed with the olive, the laurel shall wave, and form a bright wreath for the brow of the brave. And so it is this poem, with rhythm and all, that became the template for the Star Spangled not the national anthem, the Star Spangled Brand, yeah. And so it is at this moment then that America's sense of patriotism and identity was consolidated at the expense of defeating Muslims on the Barbary coast. And then, of course, the Navy was built. They were able eventually to confront the British in the War of 1812, and so history progresses. Around this time, America's confidence on the rise, the Ottoman Empire on the decline. What happened is the missionaries started venturing out of the United States to go and change the world into America in America's image. So what happened was now American Protestants, for the most part, started to believe, they were convinced that the Muslims of the Middle East, even though they've been there since biblical times, were not good enough Christians. So we need to take them a brand of Christianity and change them into, so the Orthodox Christians and the Greek Orthodox, the Catholics, and a variety of different Christian sects now were confronted, as well as Muslims, by the arrival of American Protestant missionaries trying to convert them to their faith. And in the process, it was a long and hard process, took many, many years and many decades. And then they realized that the conversions among Christians were few, among Muslims almost non-existent. Melville wrote about this, that it's impossible to do this to Muslims. So they decided then, the missionaries, to do something different. They decided to bring a secular gospel to these people. Instead of teaching them the ways of the Protestant Bible, they should now bring them the goods of civilized life, clinics, education, and then things like this, gadgets of different kinds. And one of them, who is one of the most remarkable missionaries in this case, is also a Mainer. His name is Cyrus Hamlin. Some of you may have heard of him. He graduated from Bowdoin. I studied at the Bangor Theological Seminary, and then he was a Congregationalist minister, if I'm not mistaken, and then he went to Turkey. And in Turkey, he and another philanthropist started a Robert College, which is one of the best colleges at the time in the Middle East, and soon after that, a college for women. This was remarkably revolutionary at the time, and then he started this tradition of bringing American education to the Middle East. Now he did this. These colleges were established before before MIT ever existed, or the University of California system. And when Hamlin came back to the United States, he then became, at one time, he presided over a very dysfunctional college, Middlebury College in Vermont. And he was its president for 5 years, and during which time he also opened the doors to women. So in 1883, if I'm not mistaken. So he started colleges in Turkey, came back to the United States, and started and saved Middlebury College. By the way, it was a very, very dysfunctional, and then added open enrollment to women. So you had people like this were part of this missionary movement. So by the end of the 19th century, there were dozens and hundreds of schools and clinics from Iran all the way to Egypt. And this is some of the great work that the missionary have done. And also, at the same period, the United States started supporting some of these countries like Egypt, building their military, for example. Nobody knows this fact. After the Civil War, during the Civil War, Egypt became a major producer of cotton. The United States gave them even the technology to produce better cotton and to sell it, because they wanted to stifle and kill the southern cotton industry. And so the Egyptians grew a little rich, by doing so. And after the Civil War ended, they invited some veterans to come and help them build a modern army. So, and it was very remarkable. They came, they taught them literacy, they built roads, they surveyed the country, and slowly, step by step, eventually Egypt went broke, and they couldn't keep them for a long time, so they went back. But in the process, a new culture began to enter the Middle East, and soon after that, then another university was established, by another missionary, Daniel Bliss, and the Syrian Protestant College in the 19th century, which by the early 20th century became the American University of Beirut, then the American University of Cairo, and all of a sudden, they had established enough institutions, Americans, not the British or the French, they had established enough institutions to create a sense of an Arab identity. Add to that, because Arab identity in juxtaposition to the Turks. Now, what's happening at this period in history was the Turks and the Arabs were entering a conflicted relationship, and so the United States was feeding into this sense of Arab nationhood. And so by the beginning of the 20th century, this movement was exasperated by the emigration of Syrians. These are the people who lived in the Middle East from anywhere from Syria down to Palestine were known as Syrians in American immigration terms. And so they started immigrating to the United States. And when they came here, all the religious denominations, all the religious factions that existed in the Middle East were constantly at war, they began to see themselves differently. America has a very powerful effect on immigrants, and so they began to see themselves collectively as Arabs as opposed to Turks. And in the process, they participated greatly in American culture. Amin Rihani wrote the first American novel, The Book of Khalid, in 1911. He had a Whitmanesque vision of America. He thought America should rule the world just like Whitman believed in the 19th century. There's Dr. Michael Shadid, who's, again, a Syrian who started the first cooperative hospital in the United States in Elk City, Oklahoma. He, for $25 a year, a family of four could get free medical care and all the benefits. He was attacked by the AMA and other institutions. He fought back, and he became a national hero of sort. Now he's forgotten. It's an interesting episode. Some of you may know about this. I don't know whether some of you remember Anthony Shadid, the New York Times reporter. Not too long ago, I was very curious about this Michael Shadid. I read Anthony Shadid's article. I used to read Anthony Shadid's articles all the time, and I read his book. I read this, so I wanted to find out if there's any connection. So I just go to the New York Times and I emailed Anthony Shadid, and a day later comes a response that he's in fact a cousin, and that he's in fact working on a project. He was collecting all the information he could get on him because he was going to do a book or work. He was working on this remarkable man's life. A few days later, Anthony Shadid died in Syria. So when he died, I wrote some kind of tribute in memory of this conversation and this history, which was picked up by an Oklahoma newspaper and so on and so forth. So it's a very interesting, because Michael Shadid was from Oklahoma. And so it's, and a lot of, Khalil Gibran, the Prophet book was very popular. Elvis Presley carried it with him all his life, apparently, till he died, had a big influence on him. And there's a Khalil Gibran Day in Boston. And so there are a number of Americans. And of course, if you keep going down the line, all benefited greatly from America and gave back. If you, in the field of medicine, well, he may not have been a physician, but who doesn't know Danny Thomas? He was born in the States, but he established St. Jude's Hospital. He was going through hard times, and he made a vow that if ever his fortunes changed, he would do something, a great act to benefit humanity. And so when fortunes changed for him, and by the way, he was a very heroic figure. He protected people who were blacklisted during the McCarthy era. He built St. Jude's Hospital with help of other people, now which is a great institution. And so on, and so you find people, even after 9/11, there's an Algerian immigrant who was nominated by George Bush as the director of the National Institutes of Health, which is a huge, complex organization, probably the most powerful medical organization in the world, at least in areas of research. So Arabs benefited both from America's presence, both in the Middle East, and they're here as well, and contributed very seriously to American culture and civilization. So there was a reciprocal kind of relationship. But because America always has this magical effect on people, and all of these immigrants were unanimous that the United States is great for them, and many of them actually wanted the Middle East to be patterned on the United States. There was no complex issue. There was no complex. There was no inferiority complex. Like the rest of the world, they recognized the United States was far ahead of most of the world in terms of democracy and development, and they wanted to be part of it, except one very notable figure of Sayyid Qutb. Sayyid Qutb is a prominent leader in the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. He was killed by the Nasser regime in 1966. But he came, very interestingly enough, he spent 2 years in the United States, from 1948 to 1950. And he traveled across the United States, and then he went back to Egypt, and he wrote an essay called The America I've Seen. And in this book, in this essay, he makes some scathing remarks about American materialism, about the obsession with music and so on, some very strong racist remarks, and he entered a phase of being the intellectual guru of what we nowadays call the Islamic fundamentalist movement. So it was a direct relationship, his experience of the United States. And when he went back, Israel had just been established, so all of that came into play, and he started. So he is now the leader. He is now the intellectual guru, if you want, of the Islamic fundamentalist movement. So you see that up to the middle of the 20th century, the United States had great relations, was highly admired in the Middle East. There was no one, the episodes in the 19th century Morocco, which, where the Moroccan king wanted to patent or wanted a mandate, American mandate. He preferred American mandate over a French or European one. Others felt the same way about Egypt and parts of the Middle East. There was no problem. Then two things happened in the 20th century that began to change things: the discovery and exploitation of oil, and later on the establishment of Israel. So with these two things, relationships, this attitude began to change, and we know the oil, and these are very complex issues. Oil, was discovered by Europeans and Americans in the Middle East, was developed for them by Americans in the Middle East, and was marketed for the Arabs by Americans and Europeans. The Arabs basically sat over sand which included in its bosom lots of oil. They had no technological know-how. They had no scientific knowledge to exploit that resource. They were basically, and there still is, by the way, I say it with all the sadness that accompanies it, they're mainly consumers of Western technology and Western products. So the question of Israel, I explained. There was a long history of supporting the return of Jews to the Holy Land. John Adams in 1819 was the first ex-president at that time, he was, on record to mention this. He said it would be great if the Jews were to return back and make something out of that land. And then, of course, Napoleon later on in the 19th century said the same thing. And there was a strong echo across the continents, really, whereby people saying it would be great. And it was not something, people even lobbied for this idea in Egypt and the Middle East. They went, European Jews went and said, yeah, this would be a great idea. They even published stuff. They were saying, let's support the return of. It was not a Emma Lazarus also supported this idea, although she didn't think it would apply to American Jews because they were doing fine here. So there was a long cultural, theological background to this issue. And then then how does one begin to approach this two interesting topic? Oil is more complex, but if you go back to what's happening in Israel and Palestine, and studies have shown, it is this myth of the Holy Land that has affected all sides. The Protestants, Catholics, and the Jews and the Muslims, all in equal measure, that this place is somehow holy, that God had made this place holy. It's in the Bible, it's in the Quran, but very few people take a close look at what holiness consists of. I mean, where does this holiness and sacredness of these huge monuments, whether it's the Wailing Wall or the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and other places, it's very often they were created and decreed in an arbitrary fashion. Like, for example, Emperor Constantine's mother, Helena, when she was traveling there in the 4th century, she just had a vision, a revelation. This is where Mary was, and this is where Jesus was buried, and so on. And a lot of what we take to be sacred place nowadays, there is no archaeological evidence at all that they were the place that people talked about. We're not talking about whether some of these people even existed in the first place, from Moses and so on and so forth, and Abraham. But, it is people are clashing over these places. They are shaped by centuries of notions of holiness. And I think that is what is stalling a really good, productive discussion about how to solve that problem. I think if we approach the problem as a problem of just settlement, people living here and some people making different claims to the same land, maybe we'd have a better chance of solving the problem. But by bringing a lot of the holy into the discussions get complicated. And which brings me back to why America matters. Why America matters in this conversation, and why America's sort of claim that Islam was a despotic and tyrannical religion continues to be unanswered by the Muslim side. When you look at the span of history between Jefferson and today, what we see is the same recurring pattern: lack of democracy, lack of participation, the weak civil societies, a lot of authoritarianism. So the image that the United States had of the Muslim world in 1776 hasn't really changed much. There are some differences here and there, some little, but it is, and meanwhile, other societies have moved on and moved on tremendously. I mean, the Catholics were considered to be part of the Antichrist, but now they're fine with the United States. No Protestant would think of condemning, really, the Protestants. Evangelicals even supported the Mormons during the last election, even though a lot of them are very ambivalent about this Mormon candidate. But it's like, they were, only Islam sort of maintained this unchanging image of itself. And I would claim here, both for the Americans and the Muslim world, for a good reason. And the reason is, unlike the American Revolution, which was able to separate state and church, however tenuously they did so, the Muslim world has been singularly unable to do so. We've sent advisors to Iraq to help them write a constitution. Same thing in Afghanistan, but they couldn't come up with any constitution that resembles the American Constitution of 1787. And it's because the religion has to be affirmed as the primary component of religious component of the state. Islam has to be affirmed as a primary religious component of the state. So from that flow a lot of different consequences which affect civil society, the rights of minorities, and so on and so forth. What's amazing about this recent election that happened is now, and which is also true for evangelical Christians in this country, which is, the same-sex marriage law is law now in what? How many states? A couple states, Maryland and Maine at least, and I don't know. So it is remarkable for the Muslim world to be looking at the United States and see such things become law. It is, and also the separation, how the evangelicals now in the United States are gradually losing power to the nuns, people without a religion, or other kinds of, or to a combination of people who are indifferent to religion. So the evangelical moment, the tempo is slowly subduing and declining in the United States. And the Muslim world probably sees this with a tremendous amount of awe and respect in occasion, but they cannot implement it because of the tremendous hold of the religion on those societies. And which brings us back to Jefferson. Now, Jefferson is my hero in a lot of this, and I call the Gospel of Jefferson. Jefferson wrote the Religious Act in Virginia which eventually became law and was supported by Madison, and in which, I wish I had. Let me see if I have it here somewhere. I love it. I'm going to mention it. I'm going to quote from it this weekend, but to Arab leaders in New York, because it's something they should listen to. Even before the Constitution was drafted, Virginia passed a law, enshrining freedom of religion and conscience to all Virginians, and which is the Establishment Clause, the Free Exercise Clause, and others which became part and parcel of the First Amendment. The U.S. Constitution was modeled on some of this, and the United States Constitution doesn't require any religious office, holding of religious office, to become, technically speaking, president. We have George Washington record telling Jews in Rhode Island and other places that they have their equal citizens. So the United States set in motion a notion of citizenship despite strong religious sentiment in the United States at that time, that allowed citizens to give citizens equal rights, regardless of their faith or non-faith. That is something that the Muslim world still has to learn how to do. It is struggling with it, and the Arab Spring only brought up to the surface some of this deeply entrenched attachment to a very mythical view and very highly embellished view of Islamic history. And you see, and even now the United States continues to help the Arab world find its own freedom. We know that I can give you many examples from the Arab Spring, but the one that moved me the most is WikiLeaks. Now, everybody was very upset by WikiLeaks and what to do with WikiLeaks, and the United States government is doing bad things. But I was not looking at that stuff. What I was looking is what WikiLeaks was saying about Arab regimes. And what we have is absolutely fascinating. What we have is diplomats in Tunisia, diplomats, ambassadors in Tunisia, or in other parts of the Arab world. They go and shake hands and they smile and they say nice things. And they go to their offices and write these damning reports about Ben Ali, these presidents, these autocrats, saying these are corrupt people, they're doing a lot of damage to their citizens, and so on and so forth. So we may think that the United States is negotiating with bad guys, but behind the scenes, they still exhibiting the very democratic Republican spirit that inspired them in the first place. And it is for that reason that Hillary Clinton told Arab leaders in the Gulf that their systems are untenable. It is for that reason that they supported these uprisings. But of course, the results are still, nobody knows what the outcome of this uprising will be. But if the uprising is not followed by a gospel of Jefferson and also the gospel of Thomas Paine, these are two things that are needed together to give direction, intellectual and cultural direction, to the Muslim world in order to be able to live and be comfortable living with diversity and even without religion. Thank you.
Just as we start, we're going to start with student questions first and then transition to open questions.
You think a Muslim with an American education can go back to his or her country and possibly lead the country?
And possibly?
Be a political leader or lead the country?
Yeah, they do. I was at an event at Harvard this past Friday, and they have an interesting thing going on there. It's called the Arab Week or Arab Weekend, which is for two days. People from all over North America come assemble to talk about the Arab world and its politics and so on and so forth. And one of the keynote speakers was the former Prime Minister of Egypt, who just stepped down to cede power to now Morsi, who is a member of the Muslim Brotherhood. And he is a graduate of Purdue University. He has a degree in engineering. And he started, by saying the customary Quranic injunction, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, and then he, proceeded to talk about. So what's interesting, and I'm probably might be a little bit self-serving here. What's interesting about this is a lot of this, Muslim fundamentalists who believe are actually highly trained, some often engineers in fields like engineering, and very often in the West. So they come and they go to engineering schools or mechanical engineering, computer engineering. They live in their enclaves and they go back, and that's their, that would be their full experience of their host country, the United States, or so on. And I really don't have. It's less, for these kinds of things are less likely to happen to people who have studied or immersed themselves in a culture of dialogue, humanities, philosophy, and history. Problem is, this country do not need these fields. Like the United States, humanities is dying in battlefield, and people want to engineers and more. So it's interesting. I mean, they're pursuing a notion of progress and development that is highly technical, without the cultural component that helps create a more interesting and richer social society.
There. I was wondering, how has Obama affected the Muslim world? Has his presidency had anything to do with the changes in that part of the world?
No. Obama was elected there was a tremendous amount of excitement and enthusiasm. In fact, people even sort of kind of campaigned for him, in those parts of the world, because they were so excited. 3 years later, down the presidency, maybe around 2010, his ratings were lower even than George Bush's during that time. And so it was an incredible, dramatic decline of approval rating for him. And that's because of people came to realize that the issues that he talked about in Cairo and Turkey and other places did not come to be, and people didn't know what to make of the Arab Spring, even though the Arab Spring was an interesting moment. People were raised slogans like "We love freedom," and a lot of them were in English, even in Francophone Tunisia and other places. But there was a very strong sense of disillusionment with Obama because, they like in the United States, they expected him to achieve miracles in a very short period of time. And so when that didn't happen, there was a tremendous amount of frustration. And so now I understand. I get some emails congratulating me for the election of Obama. People don't know my political affiliation, but they assume that I support Obama. So they say, congratulations, and so on and so forth. So Obama is a very interesting, ambiguous figure in that part of the world. They kind of want to see him like one of them. But at the end of the day, he's truly an American, and so he represents American interests. And so therein lies the frustration and the tension.
I just was wondering what you believe is America's responsibility towards, I guess, the progression, whenever we're in such economic turmoil right now, should we allocate some of our resources to help other nations?
I think, and this is something I told American students in Rabat last month, I think, or September, not too long ago. I told them the best thing you can do, not to be, and I mean it in all seriousness, not to be apologetic about about the real core of America. Because in the United States, if you look very carefully at the American Revolution, America is the product of a revolution. The revolution was conceived out of a number of assumptions, a philosophy of life, a way of government, separation of powers, divided sovereignties. All of these, the amount of thinking that went into the American Revolution was amazing. Not only does the rest of the world need to learn, by the way, the Declaration of Independence, where more than half the world now has their own declaration, was an inspiration to half of the world's nations. By the time Jefferson died, I think it was 1826, the very old age, many countries had adopted their own declaration. There's even a Declaration of Human Rights. Everybody has a declaration nowadays. It all began with the Declaration of Independence. And what is a Declaration of Independence? It's not a Declaration of Independence like Armitage, the great scholar of the American Constitution of that document says. It's a Declaration of Interdependence. Because if you notice, what is stated in the Declaration is it's an appeal to the opinion of mankind. The United States, the revolutionaries, were making an appeal to the opinions of mankind. They're making a case. They say, we want to be part of the global community. And it's global from day one. The issues were related to tea. Tea was imported from India. And the British imported it from India. They taxed American colonialists. It was the globalization was at work big time during the American Revolution. The revolutionary fathers, or founders, I should say, knew that, and they knew that they wanted to be part of this global community, which is why they were outraged by the Barbary attacks on them and so on and so forth. The Americans, I find it very, very frustrating. I'm not the only one. A lot of people in my part of the world, also where I came from, think so. They should not apologize for what America stands for. If they do, they should try the Chinese method or some other method, the Indian method or the Russian one. They don't have the same values, they don't have the same principles, and of course, as you just said, in the Islamic and the Arab world, they're completely absent. So it is Thomas Jefferson, the founding father, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the Act of Religious Freedom in Virginia, and a bunch of documents like those that should we should all carry in our hands and say, this is what America stands for. We could say that to people who want to change the system in the United States, and we should change it to everybody across the globe, because there's no other model in the world right now. And it's good to learn from other cultures. But the United States, like all the Arabs who came in the 20th century here, the great writers and philosophers and ministers said, they were completely uncomplicated about it. The United States is the world's leader, and we all stand to benefit from it in the right fashion, not in the exploitative, imperialist, and so on and so forth.
We'll open it up to open questions from anyone now.
Well, first, I'd like to thank the University of New England for having a seminar like this and opening up to the general public. It exposes us to many different points of view throughout the program. Secondly, if you haven't read Anouar's book, he may say it's not worth the $40 and buy it cheaper, but I believe if you read it, you'll find out it is worth the $40. The question I have is, in your book, you mentioned that if we could spend a portion of what we spend on military aid to countries in the Middle East on education, that it would be far to the benefit. And as we in the United States begin to use our own resources in oil, and I think I heard tonight by the mid-2030s, we're expected to be an oil exporting nation. Do you see, if we do not have to protect the oil companies' interests in the Middle East, that will allow us to put more money into education, which would benefit the people and not just the select few?
I absolutely believe it. I really do think that education, and not just because I work in a university, and I think education is absolutely, without any question, and I'm not an economist, is the absolute best investment anyone can make. Locally, in public schools here, because the investment is low, the environmental impact is minimal and negligible, the yield is almost infinite. Think about that. You know, it's the amount of, let's say that one of my children goes to King Middle School. What a school, I mean, it's been there for, how many generations of people has it graduated? And what kinds of educations did they go to? And what did they become later on in life? And how much did they end up contributing to society? The school is barely, is fiscally challenged, and the teachers and the principal are trying to make do with whatever they have. And yet, if you compare the outcome of what comes out of this school compared to, you name it, some other big bank or international bank or AIG or Citibank, I could make a case that however you look at things, that investment, the school, King Middle School, is a better investment than AIG. Now, in terms of, take 200 years of America's presence in the Middle East, what do we have left that is the pride of their nations? The American University of Beirut, the Robert College, American University of Cairo. Now, Dubai, Qatar, and a lot of these nations are pouring billions of dollars into education cities. They're importing MIT, they're importing Cornell, they're importing everything. But they have not been able to achieve these dramatic results that a few embattled, impoverished missionaries were able to do in the 19th century. And just compare the case of Israel and the Arab world. Israel was founded in 1948 as a state. Israel now, every year there's a Shanghai rankings of universities. They list the top 500 universities in the world. The Israeli universities always rank in the top, And not Hebrew University was established decades before there was an Israeli state. The moment the European Jews started going to that place, one of the first things they did, they established a university. And Israeli knowledge and technology and know-how is benefiting everybody. They invented drip irrigation in the 1960s, which is now extremely beneficial to a country like Morocco, which doesn't have enough water, let alone countries like Egypt and other places. So in fact, they have created a whole bunch of technology. If you don't believe me, there's a book called Startup Nation, and it shows you the tremendous amount of things that came out of Israel. That's why big corporations like Google and everybody else goes there, because they invest heavily in education, and they are democratic to the fullest extent possible. You can even argue that the Arabs in Israel, for the most part, are better off than Arabs in Syria, Iraq, and a lot of other places. I mean, they serve in parliament, they're in the Supreme Court. They object to Israeli policies. Nobody puts them in jail. Nobody liquidates them. And there's a lot to be said. And they have a lot of activists who work on their behalf. Nothing is perfect. What I'm saying is we don't have, in the entire Arab world, there is nothing comparable to what's happening in a tiny nation like Israel. In the early, what do you call it, the beginning of the 21st century, the 2000s, the United Nations started issuing Arab Human Development reports, authored by Arabs, not by Europeans, not by Americans, and the reports are absolutely damning. One of them was considered to be, Time magazine called it, I think in 2002, Book of the Year, because it was so. I mean, these Arabs got together and said, we are deficient in everything. The only thing we've done is beef up the security apparatus of each nation and oppress our people. There's no civil society, very poor education, the list is huge. The list of deficits is huge. I think that's what needs to be done. And what needs to be done is educate, invent, to create more initiatives, and it's proven. Whether it's going to happen, I don't know. The United States likes to sell its military hardware to those countries, and it makes money out of that. So so business interests keep clashing against democratic ideals, and somewhere along this fault line, somebody has to make a decision about how to approach this. But military equipment, more investments in military, it's not going to solve that problem. Yeah.
You talked about the difficulty in creating, hi Anouar, about creating the Iraqi constitution because of the centrality of the concept of the separation of church and state in the American Constitution, and the importance in the Middle East of the Muslim law being incorporated as the primary source of law. Maybe this is something you're going to address in your speech in a few days on the controversial topics about constitutions. But what's the solution to that? There's an obvious tension there, and what do you see as a way through that minefield?
Yeah, thank you. I wrote in 2007 a book called A Call for Heresy, and I think what Muslim societies need is heretics. Now that's, in other words, people who challenge the sacredness of religion. I do that. I personally think religion is human-made. There's nothing sacred about it. And I mentioned this in the books. And I said, sacredness is of our own making. It's we decide, I mentioned in the book at some point, just sort of jokingly, I say, there's why would Mecca be more holy than, or Saudi Arabia be more holy than Uruguay, or why would Iceland is nowhere in any map of the sacred, that kind of monotheistic sacredness. These are things of our own making. We know full well the reason why we have a lot of prophets, monotheistic prophets, emerge from that little tiny part of the globe. It's because there's a connection. Judaism inspired the Christian faith. Both of them inspired the rise of Islam. And it's a perfectly fine sociological explanation for why we have these three main religions over which people are clashing constantly. So now, Judaism and Christianity have come to terms with this discussion. You could you could, there's the higher criticism of the 19th century. One could question a lot of things about Christianity, and it would be perfectly fine. Nobody would kill you or do something bad to you. And I think that's true of Judaism too. But in Muslim societies, there's still apostasy laws. If you change your religion. Now, how about the culture of human rights? You're not supposed to change your religion. If you change, that's a capital crime for which you could be condemned to death. Now, in Morocco, they're trying to change that. They're trying to abolish, in fact, the death penalty. But a lot of Arab societies are still unwilling to touch this subject. The sacred is has totally dominated people's minds. And I think what's happening, and I'm going to share with you some of my experiences in the United States. What's happening is a lot of people, out of good intentions, the liberals and not liberals, all kinds of political persuasions, maybe except for the evangelical right. People think that Islam, there are only a few, bad cases of Islam, but they're not willing to challenge the fundamental tenets of this faith, just as they do for Christianity and Judaism and other religions as well. And I think if Muslims don't do this for themselves, if they don't revise their history or rewrite their history and rethink their history. Well, take about the Salafis today. Muslims, they say, ever since Napoleon entered Egypt in the late 18th century and conquered, apparently this is the great myth of the Middle East, as you probably know, the Egyptians were shocked. Oh my gosh, these Christians now are secular, don't care about religion. Although they were studying Egyptian culture and civilization. They brought a lot of scholars, Napoleon brought a lot of scholars with him. And they said, well, we're not being challenged by Christianity. There's a new Europe that's coming to challenge us, but they don't care about religion. And they began to look at inward, and they decided, okay, we need to face up to these Europeans. How do we do this? Well, ever since then, there were two options. Really, only one option, because the other option never took off, is if we can only recapture the pure faith of the ancestors, of the first Muslims, we can overcome our deficiencies and catch up to the West and be as strong as them. It has been a discourse that has permeated Arab and Muslim thought ever since. And they're still saying that now. Now, if you tell them, listen, if you go back to this golden age that you're talking about, which is the age of the Prophet and the people who succeeded him, the caliphs, all you find is assassinations, bloodsheds, and then the dynasty that killed each other. They decapitated each other's heads. They were horrible massacres. It's too gruesome even to show to kids. But this is what they think is the golden age. This is the age of the righteous caliphs. And if we can only go back to that moment of pure faith in Islamic civilization, we can really recover our strength and be the match to the West that we used to be. They don't think, like a lot of other nations do, like the Israelis do. Like instead, how about establishing better universities, getting more modern education, and doing this and this and this and that? Because that's the way to the future. They keep going back to the ancient past to strengthen themselves in the future. It's a strange, nostalgic moment, a vast nostalgic movement, which has constantly frustrated them, and they seem to be totally stuck in this mindset. And that is a huge problem that has to be addressed by everybody, not just Muslims and Arabs, but everybody, because it is affecting world peace and the coexistence of nations.
Thanks, Anwar. Can you help us understand a bit more what you mentioned is the disappointment in the Arab world over the first Obama administration? You take the example, say, of Libya, which has been heralded by the administration as a great success for the way in which they built the international coalition and did the no-fly zone and helped to defeat Gaddafi with, reducing the bloodshed and civil war length in the country. So as one example of the kind of interventions that I would think would actually be responded to positively in the Arab world as far as what has happened during the first Obama administration. So how do you explain the letdown and the disappointment?
I think the enduring issues like the Israeli-Palestinian issue, what is happening in Iraq, and you know, I'm saying I'm looking at the polls that were taken, the Pew Foundation and others. I mean, they were shocking numbers. I mean, so what happened in Libya recently was the Libyans, and as the Tunisians did, and as the Egyptians did, if you look at that moment of the Arab Spring, it was an incredible moment of hope. And then, I don't know, I haven't seen any recent polls, but it looks like Obama lost a lot of this support in that region, and partly because some of the problems that they were hoping they were probably hoping him to be some sort of pro-Muslim champion. He's going to go on the world stage and support their causes left and right. But they placed a lot of expectation on him in a way they would never have placed on Bush or other presidents. And then eventually they came up against the reality of politics, just like many American liberals did. You know, there was a moment of disillusionment with Obama. I don't know what it is now, but I think maybe it's changed now after the election. But it looks like it mirrored some of that, but even more intensely. I don't know. There are many reasons, but the polls were very damning. I mean, he did worse than Bush after 3 years in office, before he left office. So it was disappointing to me, you know. Yeah. Microphone. Right?
We know that in many ways the
The microphone.
We know that in many ways the history of this country has been inspirational in many ways, but we also know that there have been a lot of awful things that this country has done in the name of its flag. And somebody explained it to me once this way, that, well, you know, America is one of the most successful brands in the world, and that people really buy into the brand. And then sometimes they get the product and they bring it home and it's not what they expected, but the brand is very durable. So I'm thinking, what is it in your mind that Islam, if you could think of Islam, what does Islam have to offer the world in terms of its nature, its aesthetic, what is it that we can gain by embracing Islam, not as a religion, but as a neighbor, as an intellectual neighbor, an aesthetic neighbor?
You know, I'm tempted to answer the question in a maybe a too simplistic or simple fashion, which is everything you would gain from Christianity. If you think Christianity has something to offer, Islam has something to offer. No, well, I mean, that's, you know, you pray, you are kind to you love your neighbors, well, you know, one day I'd be driving around and I see these beautiful churches and these cathedrals. I said, only strong faith produce these wonderful monuments that we all cherish, whether we are religious or not. It's beautiful. Religions have this power to create beauty, but they also have the power to create very strong exclusivist mindsets. And because you cannot be truly a Muslim and Christian at the same time. If you're a Muslim, Christianity and Judaism and everything else are inferior religions. They are heresies. They need to be condemned and challenged and fought until everybody becomes a Muslim. When I was after 9/11 again, I gave a talk at the famous church in Boston, South Street Churches. What is it called? Old South Church. And I was interesting. I was, again, soon after 9/11, it was a beautiful moment. It was being recorded for public television in Boston. And somebody said, after I finished speaking, somebody said, you know, there was a wonderful guy, I think from Morocco. And he said, you know, after 9/11, we all rallied to make sure he's okay, that nobody bothered him, that he was fine with the authorities. They extended a tremendous hand to these young men. And this young man in turn looked at them and he said, I thank you so much. You're wonderful. I love America. I love you. I mean, why don't you become Muslims? An exclusivist mind really has a hard time living with diversity. Now, It's interesting. In the Middle Ages, they were able to live with ambivalence. And there's no better sign of culture than living with ambiguity and ambivalence. People were able to say yes and no. It is only in the modern age, with the rise of scientific thinking, that particularly with the Cartesian mode of thinking, that dogma enters its religion. For example, you find even by the end, when you have Montaigne writing his essays, there were free-flowing reflections on life. By the time René Descartes comes on the scene, you begin to sense a rigidity in the way the faith is understood. Now, we have an erroneous notion of the Middle Ages. If you go up to the 18th century in Europe, I mean, England was making alliances with Morocco against Spain, or France was making alliances with Turkey against some European power, and this was rampant in the 15th century in Spain. I mean, Christian kingdoms allied themselves with another Muslim kingdom against another Christian. They were fighting kind of, but they were really not that rigid about their faiths the way we have become. It's a wrong conception we have of the past sometimes. Things were more fluid before the rise, if you will, of the scientific age. Science has created very strong boundaries and has trapped people behind them. I think we should end here because I'm getting people, they're getting mad at me down behind in the booth. Thank you so much.